I was getting pretty frustrated with that spiritual search. And one of my brothers basically said it was time to take a leap of faith, because it was impossible for a person who has finite capabilities compared to an infinite God to be able to understand infinity in order to make your decision. That made a lot of sense, and I committed my life to Jesus Christ that night. They responded this way. They said, well, Ed, now that you made the most important decision in your life, you need to decide what you want to do with it. And I said, okay, as a new Christian, what would you counsel me to think about? He said, well, are you interested in serving the Lord? I said, absolutely. He said, well, that means that full-time Christian ministry. Being a new believer, I didn't know what that meant. So I said, well, define full-time Christian ministry for me. Their definition was, you should go on to be a pastor or a missionary or a parachurch worker, and they really help you, your next step ought to be going to seminary. I said, well, what's the alternative? And he said, well, here are two things to think about in the alternative. The alternative is, then you go out to the secular world where you're not going to make much of an impact except to make sure that you tithe so you can fund the people who are actually doing full-time Christian ministry. And every now and then, if you get a chance to share the gospel, that would be great. Somehow that wasn't resonating with me, because even as a new Christian and reading scripture, there seemed to be a disconnect there. Well, after we talked, I ended up being more confused than ever, because here I heard from a lot of people this was the path. But yet when I looked at the Bible said something completely different. And it wasn't until, so I graduated, I ended up taking a secular job. And the most interesting thing about that was that weekend, after my first week of work, I was walking out of the church that I was going to, and I saw my boss's 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 boss walk out of the church at the same time. He was the guy who gave the new employee seminar to all the new employees. And I went right up to him and I asked him, how long have you been a Christian? He said, for about 25 years. I said, how long have you been in the workplace? For about 20 years. Could you please mentor me on how to integrate my faith into my work? And the most important lesson that he taught me during his lifetime was that all Christians, without exception, are called to full-time Christian ministry. But full-time Christian ministry isn't defined specifically as being a pastor, missionary, or parachurch worker, but it's wherever you dedicate whatever you're doing to glorify God. And so you can do that in the workplace. God considers that ministry and worship. My name is Ed Moy. I had the privilege of working in the White House from 2001 to 2006, and I served as the 38th Director of the United States Mint. I'm also a follower of Jesus Christ.